Good evening. I'm Karen Nelson. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture at the Boston Architectural College, where we have programs in landscape, interior architecture, architecture, and design studies. The BAC has been recognized with distinction for its leadership role in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through design. It's my pleasure to introduce the BAC's second event in the student-sponsored lecture series of Fall 2021, Just Design, a lecture by Bishakh Som. Bishakh is an Indian-American trans femme visual artist, author, and ex-architect. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, We're Still Here, Beyond, The Strumpet, The Boston Review, Black Warrior Review, Vice, The Brooklyn Rail, BuzzFeed, Inkrick, The Huffington Post, The Graphic Canon, and Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream. She received the Xeric Grant in 2003 for her comics collection, Angel. Her graphic novel, Aspara Engine, is the winner of 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Best Graphic Novel, and a 2021 Lambda Literary Award winner for Best Novel. I'm sorry, for Best LGBTQ Comics. Her graphic memoir, Spellbound, was also a 2021 Lambda Literary Award finalist. Bishakh holds a Bachelor of Science in Interior Design from Cornell University and a Master of Architecture degree from Harvard University. She worked at several architectural design firms in New York City for nearly 20 years before launching her career in writing and drawing comics. I think that you will see in Bishakh's drawing the kind of expanded conventions of architectural drawing and graphic novels that asks us to question our physical form and the space made around us. Melina Moses writes in Single-Handedly about the shared tectonic quality of all of the settings in all of her graphic work. Please give a warm welcome to Bishakh Som as she presents Drawing It Out, Architectural Space and Representation Through the Graphic Lens. Thanks.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Jade, and all of the BAC for having me here. I'm going to do a little presentation which is, I guess, a sort of tour through my evolution as a student of drawing mainly, because that's I think the thread that ties all of the images together that you'll see, but also as in my evolution as a student of architecture, as an architect, as a burgeoning graphic novelist, as a graphic novelist who is, I guess, still burgeoning, and an artist. So let me share with you some images on that journey that I started, oh, so many moons ago. Can you all see that? Yeah, okay. I think the title is a little different than I had planned, but anyway. A little tour through my life in drawing. I've always been drawing ever since I was a kid, and I think a lot of us start off that way, and some of us just keep doing it, and so for some of us it sort of falls by the wayside. These are some of my earliest comics. I won't share with you the stuff I did in 3rd grade, but these these are comics that I did like when I was 16, 17, 18. And you can see there's some interest already in that like middle panel of like an interest in setting and interiors, and a very, very rudimentary grasp of perspective, but it was a start, right? When I got to Cornell after a sort of failed attempt at being in pre-med, I went into the interior design program, and this is the kind of work we did there. And in a way, it was a stepping stone to architecture, but I learned a lot. I learned by drawing during this time about how to have a grasp of space, right? Just by the act of drawing, of trying to describe spaces like this in 3 dimensions gave me a whole sort of arsenal of tools to start my practice of interacting with the idea of form and space. So yeah, a lot of work at this point was very influenced by stuff I had just been finding out about, like Zaha Hadid and Peter Eisenman, stuff like this. And I was just being, sort of grasping at things and collaging them together with an idea that it was somehow avant-garde. During this time, I was also doing a lot of comics, and I sort of moved on from my earlier juvenilia into more stuff that was more delineated, I guess, and wasn't so ethereal. And I started using ink finally. You can also see here an evolution of that sort of initial seed of interest in interiors and in framing and composing how interiors are represented on a page or in the space of comics and graphic novels. After I finished Cornell, I went to the GSD just up north, across the river from you all. And I think the comics fell a little bit by the wayside during this time. But my drawing continued because I'm not sure about you all, but we were drawing by hand back then. So you can see the plan on the bottom was hand drawn. And well, the model is obviously not hand drawn, but handmade. But also this is the kind of work we were doing at the time. Also very influenced by ideas that I got from, deconstructivist architects that I thought were like extremely rad at the time. And that I also had an interest in collapsing forms of representation on top of each other, and an interest in the visual kind of graphic aspect of architecture at the time. And an interest, my interest in drawing was kept evolving, even though the kinds of drawings I was doing started to become very specific, in the sense that the sort of explorations I had done of bodies in space, I wasn't able to do that so much with this kind of drawing, but I still enjoyed the act of drawing and the practice of drawing. While I was at Harvard, I had an opportunity to study abroad at Cambridge University in England. And I had a chance to sort of experiment a bit with forms of representation in architecture. So in addition to this kind of thing where you have like I was kind of going along with standard forms of section drawing and plan drawing, I was also beginning to take an interest in things like collage, which seemed to be at the time a very Cantabrigian form of representation. Specifically, I'm not talking about your Cambridge, but the UK Cambridge, and collage seemed to be a way over there to explore different ideas about space and theme and concept, which is something I'd never tried. So this is a collage I did of this project that I did at Cambridge, which was exploring the space of the domestic interior and the space of domestic labor, specifically things like spaces like the kitchen, which I think will come up later on. That very same project in which the collage was the sort of exploration part of, I eventually designed a building, and I was talking to my studio mates about, some of my work in comics, and they actually convinced me as part of my final project to present not just perspectives of the building, but to draw a comic that would choreograph characters walking through the building as if it was a walkthrough, as if it was an animated walkthrough, but then sort of laid flat on on several pages, and one that has a narrative to it, right? So there are these two characters who have some history, who are walking through the building. And while they're telling you their story, you're also getting to see all the aspects of the architectonics of the building. So this is the first time I attempted anything like this, right? I'm not sure that my professors actually got anything out of it. They just thought, I really don't know. I think they thought I was like, anyway, I won't go into what they thought because I don't know. After I graduated from Harvard, I started like focusing a little bit more on comics and taking it a little more seriously. Even as I started work in architecture, I started work at IMP's office at Pei Fried in the late 90s. And as a sort of antidote to the kind of work I was doing during my day job, I was focusing a lot on my own comics. So this is an early comic from that time. And the interesting part about this is that I actually modeled the interior of the spaces in this comic, which you see in the first panel. I modeled that as a 3D model in AutoCAD, which enabled me to take shots or, sort of shots of the interior from within the model, which I then traced over to get these perspectives, which then became the sort of establishing shots of the comic. I don't do that anymore because it's way too much work, but it was interesting as an experiment, I was also experimenting with different tools and materials. So I started inking with a brush rather than a pen, which gave my work a certain sort of thickness and texture and density at the time. I was involved with a comics group called High Horse. There were 4 of us who did comics together as a sort of team, and that really pushed me forward to start to take comics a little more seriously as a sort of parallel practice to architecture. This is a cover for issue 4, where you can see that there are certain elements of architecture that are starting to creep into the comics work again. And I'm starting to take a few liberties with the way the architecture itself is being expressed and my own interest in sort of dynamic forms. I moved on after Pei Fried to a smaller office, which shall remain unnamed. But this is the kind of work I was doing there, a lot of which was sort of the beginning of my disenchantment with the practice of architecture. And I don't mean to scare anyone off or anything. This is just my personal experience. But this is the kind of work I was doing at the time. But also simultaneously, I was allowed to take some of what I learned, my interest in form and space, and to use that in the practice. So I was doing a lot of 3D modeling of spaces that we were designing, which later would, turn into renderings. So I actually took some pleasure in the sort of building up of these models, because I learned a lot about how things were put together just by the practice of constructing these 3D models, right? So yeah, this is the kind of stuff I was working on then, which I don't know, at the time I felt like I was sort of coasting along, but at some point it sort of imploded, because I think there was only a few aspects of the practice that I really enjoyed. And I realized about myself that that wasn't enough for me as a practitioner to be able to be an architect. Like you have to love all, like 80% of the aspects, right? Not just 20 or 10%. So I kind of felt like I had to veer off and do my own thing. Around this time, or maybe it was after I realized I had to kind of go off and do my own thing, I started focusing on my own work in comics and illustration. And I was lucky enough to be able to work on this project, which is a book written by my colleague and friend, Deborah Schneiderman, about the history of the prefabricated bathroom, which sounds a little esoteric, but actually it's also a kind of retrospective of prefabrication in modernism and beyond, right? So I got to do all these great, well, if I'm allowed to toot my own horn, I really enjoyed doing these illustrations of aspects of the history of prefabrication. So on the right there, you have Buckminster Fuller with one of his prefabricated bathrooms. I was looking at Grimshaw, Nicholas Grimshaw, and some of the work he was doing with prefab bathrooms. And also the idea of like studies in kitchen design as a parallel practice to that. This is the Frankfurt kitchen by Margaret Schütte-Lehotzky, which will show up later, spoiler alert. So that was a fun project for me. At around that same time, I was also continuing to develop my comics practice. I didn't quite have a notion of how to pursue sort of sustained work at the time. So I was doing a lot of contributions to anthologies. This is a piece I did for a book called Beyond Volume 2, which is a collection of queer and trans sci-fi and fantasy comics. This is a contribution that I made to another anthology called The Other Side, which is even more specific because it's an anthology of queer paranormal romance comics. But it was a good time for me, like to sort of spread my wings and to sort of dabble in various aspects of the comics world. Another anthology that I was really happy to be part of was We're Still Here, which is, I believe, the first all trans comics anthology. And I'm sure there's more now, but I was really excited to be part of that. Circling back a little bit to architecture, I also contributed to a book called Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream, which was an homage to Winsor McCay and his creation, this character that he created, Little Nemo. So this is a giant book, which is basically the size of a newspaper, in, let's say, the New York Times when it's unfolded, but the entire book is that dimensions, right? This is a one-page comic that I did for that anthology, in which I was playing with the idea of a sort of static space with a body moving through it, right? So it's collapsing time and motion onto a sort of fixed image, which is something I think I think there are ideas of like this when I was doing when I was studying architecture, but it's the first time I actually implemented it because I had the actual dimension to do something like this. And the same character you can see is starting from the top left corner, walking her way through this building, which is ostensibly her thesis project from grad school. So this is why it's giving her nightmares. But traveling through it as if you're walking through a dream, right? Not sure that I would ever try this again because it was a lot of work. At the same time, I was starting to do work in sort of standalone paintings, just because I found it much more therapeutic and in a way than comics, which involves a lot of planning and laying out and a certain degree of rehearsal, let's say, whereas these paintings allowed me to explore ideas of form and space and the body within those spaces with a little more liberty, I guess, you know. And this is something I started to do around this time because I was, you know, by this time I'd quit my job in architecture, but I really wanted to revive that energy that I had in grad school, the sort of energy that I got out of drawing, which I lost when I started doing the actual practice of architecture. So I wanted to bring it back and put it into my artwork. And these are the kinds of spaces that I was interested in exploring within these standalone paintings. Some of them are very sort of explicitly architectural and are exploring sort of ideas about depth and layering and perspective. Others are a little more fantastical, but also trying to imbue a sense of dynamism to spaces as they're represented on a page or, you know, within the space of a painting. Yeah, I was really like, you know, I was thinking a lot about how bodies are almost completely absent sometimes within architectural representations. Like, you know, you think of renderings of spaces and there are these kind of generic bodies and characters that inhabit a lot of images that you see of buildings or of proposals of projects. And I wanted to have a certain specificity to the characters that inhabited my buildings, the worlds that I was creating. And you to the point where you could almost sense a sort of unspoken narrative to these characters in the way you can sort of mine an unwritten sort of seam, an untold story that you can sort of make up for yourself. And in that sense, I was very influenced by Cindy Sherman's work. I was lucky enough while I was freelancing to work on a book with Abby Suckle, who also worked at I.M. Pei's office. And it was a book based on a program called Cocktails and Conversations, which took place at the Center for Architecture, in which architects were interviewed by a journalist or another architect. And then while a cocktail was designed to complement this conversation. So I was able to take my sort of skills as an artist in watercolor and to bring them to the illustrations that were in this book. So I was just trying to, I guess the sort of notion of this was that I was trying to represent the architects within their own architecture or interacting with the architecture that they had brought forth, you know? So this is the kind of page layout. You can see the drink on the top right there that goes with Daniel Libeskind's work. So this was a really good time for me because I got to be part of an architectural practice without without having to do all the like that 80% that I was really sort of which seemed like anathema to me. You know, I got to do the drawing part of it, which was my sort of, you know, happy place in the world. From this, I actually took some inspiration while working on this book from people that I was, architects that I had been drawing. So, for example, we did a layout for Louisa Hutton, whose work, if you don't know, has a lot of sort of polychromy to it, right? This isn't her work, this is my work, but I sort of stole that idea from her of this like kind of kaleidoscopic surface that would cover a sort of undulating landscape, which could also be a building. And at this time I was, again, returning to my practice as a watercolor painter, but working on a larger scale because I think that gave me a little more freedom to explore these ideas, right? And I also started animating, not literally, but like having bodies in motion within the space of these paintings, and not, you know, as I was mentioning before about these sort of static figures that you find in architectural renderings, that I wanted to do the exact opposite here and have people dancing and jumping and leaping within the space of these buildings or landscapes. This is some of more of that work from the time in which I was kind of collapsing ideas of maps and cartography with architecture. So the two-dimensional sort of flat plane of the map in this piece becomes and evolves or grows into the three-dimensionality of a landscape or an architectural project. And again, I was looking back at this idea of polychromy and of surfaces that wrap around architectural forms and give those forms a kind of legibility and richness, right? Around 20, well, I had been working a lot on comics during that time, but it was only in 2019 that I managed to finally put together enough work, actually more like 2018, but enough work to make the idea of 2 graphic novels possible. I hadn't planned on 2, but that's the way it was. So the first one was this collection called Apsara Engine, which I had been working on for a while, which is a collection of 8 stories, which finally got published by the Feminist Press in 2020. The other one is a graphic memoir called Spellbound, which was published also in 2020, lucky me, by Street Noise Books. So the memoir is, I won't go into the sort of conceit of it. Needless to say, there's a substitute character that I put in the book who represents me. This was also the beginning of my coming out as trans. So I'm not going to get into the psychology of it too much, but this is the kind of work that was in that book. There's a small interest in architecture, and as in a sort of scene setting tool, but you'll see in the next book how architecture really comes to the forefront. So this is the next book, or the first book that I mentioned, Apsara Engine, a collection of 8 stories, some of which are sort of fantastical and deal with themes of South Asian culture, mythology, gender, the body, and some of which are excuses for me to again go back to this idea of the space, collapsing the space of architectural representation onto the space of the graphic novel or the page of comics, right? So this is one experiment in that vein in which a section cut through a building serves as a sort of world in which this character, this Indian woman, moves through the building at different points in time, and her thoughts are called out as if they're architectural details, you know, so they're like bubbles connecting her head to the blow up of what's going on in her head, you know, so it's almost as if the details are like the detail of the way two walls meet is here the detail of how a psyche works, right? So it's like taking the idea of blowing up the detail to a psychic level. Same idea here, but taken from a sort of axonometric point of view. It's almost like a perspective crashing into an axonometric. And some of the stories were also just somewhat slice of life stories that eventually take a wrong turn into the uncanny. But you can also see there's an interest in depicting the spaces in which these characters are interacting with each other. You know, so I still do take a great interest these days in showing in my work how the characters, the bodies within these stories are involved in their world, in their built world, in their built environment. One story in the book is very concerned with architecture and cartography. It's a story called Swan Dive, in which 2 characters use the power of drawing to actually realize and will into being the worlds that they've created. It's kind of too much to go into at this point, but needless to say, the inspiration comes from my own always going back to drawing as a practice that has always been, to me, a kind of therapy, but also a way to make things possible for myself in the world. Not just images, but like entire kind of creations of culture, you know, which is, I think, a very queer strategy in the sense that queer people tend to, and this is a big generalization, but they also tend to, they tend to improvise and create worlds that live or that exist outside the worlds that they feel that they are not part of. So that's the sort of heart of this story, right? These worlds that they will into being, I've rendered as these sort of kaleidoscopic spaces that are, again, sort of overlays or collapsed, like sort of overlaps between forms of representation. I think you can see that the most here, where there's sort of decorative elements that then morph into architecture, which then morphs into a sort of map. And then there's a sense that these bodies and moments in time are sprinkled throughout this kaleidoscope, so that there's a sense that there are multiple moments in time and space that exist on this page in a way that I think can only be done through the medium of comics. I could be wrong about that, but it's something I'd like to believe. After those two books came out during the pandemic, I went back again to my love of painting. And again, I was talking about how painting is therapy. This was really my salvation during the pandemic. So I went back to explorations of bodies, of form, of motion, of dance and architecture, all in the same space of a piece of artwork, right? And I continued to think about how bodies are framed by interiors and by architecture. Sometimes I was playing with scale a bit too, because I was interested in, the scale of the urban fabric, but how do bodies exist within that urban fabric in the space of representation? So I started just kind of having giants within these urban landscapes that sort of collapsed scales together, right? And I was also interested in the idea of again, the sort of domestic interior, these sort of slightly mundane moments, which nevertheless have a sort of unwritten or unspoken narrative to them. Going back a little bit to the Frankfurt kitchen, which I talked about as part of my the prefab bath project and the space of the domestic interior, I remembered that work while I was working on these pieces, and the sort of systematic nature of this project and how beautifully composed I thought her work was. And I took that inspiration and wanted to inject bodies into that space, right? So that you have these sort of femme characters inhabiting Schutelhotsky's project and giving it some sort of animation or life, right? I was also looking at, I don't know why I went down this path. I guess my sort of pandemic brain was just inventing things for me to explore. So I was looking at early, I think I just started looking at my old books and just rediscovering, the history of modernism and, architects like Gropius, who I took as the inspiration for certain paintings in which people of color suddenly kind of disrupt the space of white modernism, right? Along with sheep. I was also really inspired at the time by the work of Kurt Schwitters, specifically his Merzbau projects, which I believe these are reconstructions of those projects, right? Because I don't think the only records of his work are in photographs. But I was really, I'd forgotten how much I loved his work. I sort of took a sort of 20-year hiatus from that from indulging in that kind of loving that kind of work, right, into taking it as an inspiration for my own work. So I was exploring in these comics, or sorry, these paintings, domestic spaces that had sort of been infected with a Kirchwitter's virus in a way, and the way that like these in interiors suddenly start to explode and morph into something quite different. Maybe, yeah, maybe it's an unfortunate verb to use at this time, but I think that's where my head was going in 2020. Finally, I just wanted to say I did do some comics during 2020, which again went back to my investigations of cartography, of architecture, but also the space of travel within that realm. I've always been very interested in travel as a sort of space within which different forms of investigation like film, architecture, and cartography can come together. I think that was something that I always knew intuitively, but I'm reading Juliana Bruno's Atlas of Emotion at the moment, which is making clear to me so many of these connections. I did this work before I read her book, but this is a comic that I did called The Tourist, which you can read. I'll put a link to it online. It was published in eFlux Journal and is about a trans woman who visits her homeland, but as a tourist because she's never lived there, and sort of discovers through traveling the spaces, the different spaces of this sort of foreign homeland, what it means to be trans, but also what it means to maybe not be part of a trans community. Which I guess in a way sort of reflects my own conflicted nature, but also my relationship to my distant homeland, which is India, and how I feel like as someone who grew up in the States, how I always feel like someone who's forever at a distance. So that's the kind of spirit and culture that I wanted to bring to this particular work. That's all I have for you in terms of images, but I'd be very happy to talk about any of that work or to field any questions you might have. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Oh my goodness, that was fantastic. Thank you, Bishakh.
You.
There were a lot of students just saying, wow, oh my God, these are amazing. Things like that we can save the chat for you that way. And I tried to spell out some of the names that you peppered your talk with so that if our students are interested further in learning about the Frankfurt Kitchen or Juliana Bruno, they'll know where to go. Yeah. But are there questions? Maybe we can ask them from the chat and then we can pose them.
By the way, I'm putting the link to that online comic in the chat right now.
Great. Yes. That's wonderful. One of the things that I noticed in reading Spellbound was the connection of memory and food and the spaces that you were traveling through. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about how you decided to include, I would say maybe the domestic in such a way.
It is interesting. There is a New York Times review of Spellbound in which I guess they mostly liked it, but their one criticism was that there was too much cataloging of food and lunches. And I'm like, kind of didn't get the point, did you? Because as you say, that it links into the idea of the domestic very much, and also to the idea of culture, because I think the point I was trying to make at one point in the book was the way in which food substitutes as a sort of shield between, as a sort of barrier against, or a defense against emotion, right? So in lieu of talking plainly and clearly about the way like the lead character and her parents interact, there's always this sort of barrier which revolves around food, because that's the one thing you can always go back to and talk about and is sort of politically or culturally neutral. So there's this obsession, particularly in, I will say, my generation of South Asian people, of always focusing on the idea of what your next meal is going to be, how, but not necessarily out of a sort of sense of deprivation or anything. It's like we like to sort of choreograph and rehearse our dinner. So we'll talk about what kind of fish we're going to get or what kind of sauce it's going to be in, and what is the side vegetable going to be like, and so on and so forth. So that, in a way, like that's something that the lead character fights against, but also inherits. So her whole cataloging of lunches has to do with the way she can't even escape that sort of cultural trapping, right? And nor maybe does she want to, even though it's sort of like a self-critique, and it's something that she just can't help, right? And I can't help either, because I remember like getting very upset with my folks when they would just want to talk about like, what kind of vegetables were going to be on the menu. And I was like, let's focus on something real. But now that's something I do. So maybe it's a coping mechanism or something. I don't know.
I certainly saw a link between the kind of food to the character's sense of well-being. Like if as the character becomes more herself, she's starting to take care better of what she'll eat, and actually taking an extra step, buying an extra lentil, or a better, glass of red wine. But I thought it was really interesting, the mirroring there.
Guilty as charged.
All right, so there's, Victoria wants to know, is there a way to buy or get your 2 comics that you created? Maybe you'll put those links in for us.
I put the links in at the beginning, but I'll put them up again.
Thanks so much.
Do that now, yeah.
Oh, Richard has done that for you.
Okay, great, fantastic, thank you.
So I wrote a question, but can I ask it, Karen?
Please, I can't see it.
First of all, thank you so much, Bishakh. This has been so meaningful for me and so
Thank you,
enjoyable.
Yeah.
And just a shout out, after reading Apsar Engine, as I told you, I will never look at maps the same way again.
Oh, I'm so glad they're coming to get you.
That's like a trailer for that book. So could you be cajoled, invited, convinced to design a building again, and of your choice? And if so, what would it be?
I would only undertake such a project if I could be like Zaha, in the sense, or having trouble thinking of someone similar. I'll take that back, because I think Zaha was very involved in her projects, right? She wasn't the sort of architect who would, the whole kind of cliche about, let's say, Frank Gehry is like, the crumpled bit of napkin, which then turns into a building, right? I would like to be somewhere in the middle of that, like I would like to have an artistic vision realized without having to do, like I mentioned, the 80% of the work that it would take to realize such a building, because as I said, that was my downfall, right? But yeah, I mean, I would like to take my love of drawing, of imagining form and space, and to have that realized in another medium other than comics or painting. But yeah, it's I think that's a bit, I don't know who would collaborate with me on such a thing.
Thanks for that. That was great.
So Farah has a question for you that she's going to ask in real time. Farah,
awesome.
Unmute.
Hi. So I would like to know, like, what would be your advice to someone who wants to develop their comic creation skills and like artistic skills?
It's funny, I'm actually teaching a course now at the School of Visual Arts in New York called Storytelling, which is forcing me to go back and put into words the things that I always took for granted intuitively. And honestly, I don't know, I took such a circuitous path to becoming a comics artist that I don't know how to give advice for the correct way to do it or what the best way it is to pursue such a path or a career. I mean, there are people who go to school to learn how to draw or draw comics and tell stories. That's not something I did, but that's one way. Honestly, I would say I think maybe develop a community is the best advice I can give. Like find other creators who are like you, who like I did with when I started that 4-person anthology, right? I found people who are my friends who could support my work and who we could critique each other's work. But also we had, like with a gang of people, we had enough sort of person power to make it possible to publish work, right? It wasn't just on one person. So just to get it out there, it was nice to have a posse, right? So I would say like find your posse, put together work together. And then like find bigger communities like at comics conventions and start a writing group, things like this. I would say finding people and forming networks of community is maybe the best way to really jumpstart a career. I don't want to use the word career, but a journey into comics.
And I wanted to read a statement, unless Jory, if you want to read your own statement, I don't see you.
Yes,
I'm going to read it for her. Yeah, Jory, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, read it. It's great. Read that.
What I wanted to state was basically that it's amazing to see your work's development. And also in mostly every single work, I really loved how I can sense the feeling of ease and letting go from like the movement of the characters. It's really nice.
That's really nice to hear. That's maybe ease and letting go. That I love that. I love that. Because people have told me that I specialize in lounging characters, right? Which I took to be a sort of insult, but now that the way you put it about the sort of ease and letting go, that seems a little more apt to me, But a lot of that, I think, I was looking at images of Charlotte Perriand and her furniture design and Eileen Gray's work, and a sort of, I think there was a sense at some point in modernism when women were involved, that there was another aspect to modernism, which I think I was trying to reinvigorate with my work now. I think if you look at images of Charlotte Perriand on one of her chairs, you can maybe get a sense of what I'm talking about. But yes, I love that. I love that idea that there's an ease and a kind of comfort and a space of tranquility that maybe is belied by the sort of hyper kind of kinetic motion that is part of the space that's being depicted.
There's one other thing that I'd like to ask about, but I don't have a question formulated well.
Yes.
It's very clear that you've inhabited maybe 3 or 4 places with very distinct cultures and architectures and, let's say, public practices, right?
Uh-huh.
And a lot of our students also belong to at least 2 geographies, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I wondered, have you ever thought about how your ability to move between and among those geographies helped you or held you back? You mentioned being at a distance in some way from some of the places, but I wondered if you could talk about that.
I guess, well, obviously or not obviously, none of that was planned, right? As I mentioned, I was originally, or maybe I don't know if I mentioned that I was originally a pre-med student at Cornell, which is an artifact of, or a result of coercion on my parents' part, as every South Asian child of a certain generation knows. What, that's an unfortunate stereotype, but in my case, it was true. So there was already a distance created at that point between, as a result of culture, between what my aspirations and my abilities, right? And it's sort of unfortunate that I was only able to do that I really love to do after the burden of familial affiliation had disappeared, which is to say that I felt a sort of weight lifting off of me, and I was able to pursue things like comics and painting, and to leave architecture behind, which, because I no longer had a sort of responsibility to other people, and I felt a sense of like openness in myself, right? So I think those distances that either geography or culture had created for me as a young person or an evolving person eventually resulted in a sort of a geography of like of fragmented distances in the person that I am now. And I think that's something I'm still trying to reconcile. I'm still trying to sew all these fragments together, which seems like a sort of impossible task. It's something that I do in my third book, which I'm writing even now. I think that's the sort of grand project of it, is to try and reimagine those distances, and to try and heal the kinds of gaps that have formed throughout a life, but also to acknowledge that certain attempts at that kind of project will inevitably result in failure, which is really okay too.
Thanks. One of our colleagues, Tina Masuri Bolden, asked, you discussed how your work responded to the absence of human bodies in architectural representation. How has the inclusion of bodies changed how you think about and create architectural space?
So I guess I've been focusing a lot on moving away from sort of epic spaces to, for lack of a better way to put it, back into investigations of interiors, which started maybe with this idea of the domestic interior and the domestic labor, and the way that we inhabit more intimate spaces like bedrooms or kitchens. And I love the things that I find really sort of exhilarating are when bodies match spaces. Like there was one painting that I showed where there's a woman sort of with her knees up, and she's completely occupying this sort of alcove behind which there's a window, but her body is shaping itself to that very intimate space, right? Which is also why I love incorporating ideas of furniture as integral parts of an interior and of architecture, and of how like all of that can be sort of regarded as a, here we go with the architecture, Gesamtkunstwerk, which is something I found really inspirational when I was a student of architecture, and this idea that all the parts are working together. But I really like the idea that you could scale it down to the scale of the body, which is, I spoke briefly about how I was like investigating like the scale of the urban landscape and sort of magnifying the scale of the body to match that, and how that creates a sort of jarring effect. But for the most part, I'd like to keep investigating how domestic interiors and bodies coexist and cohabitate.
That's fantastic. If I could ask everybody to unmute for just a moment, we're going to give Bishakh Som a round of applause on Zoom. Ready?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So sweet. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Bishakh.
Thank you. By the way, I saw a mention of Levius Woods and I was like, yes. So I guess that's pretty obvious.
It's a good one. It's another model. It's not the model, but
No,
I'm glad.
yeah,
Sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Just
Karen.
terrific.
and
Thank
Rich and
you.
Jade. Thank
Great.
you. Thank you for having me.
Jade, please close the recording. That was me.